Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. My name's Kev Cooling, your host, founder and managing director of Hut22 Limited. And today I'm joined by Sam McCabe, who is an architect and PassivHaus designer with a huge amount of experience in the realm of existing buildings. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Kev. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. I've got to admit, I'm a little bit nervous about doing this, but we'll just,
Oh,
yeah.
Don't be. You'll be absolutely fine. I'm absolutely sure of it. And you know, we're both quite relaxed. We're just coming off the back of the Christmas break, so that's nice at least, isn't it? This is a nice way to get warmed up back into the year, I reckon. So thank you so much for joining me and talking today about this whole kind of thing around existing buildings and what we should do with them. But it'd be great maybe if we could start with you telling us something about you.
Okay. Well, if you haven't guessed already, I'm not from the UK originally. I'm from Queensland in Australia, and unfortunately, I've not been able to get rid of the accent over the last 20 years in the UK. I think so. It's great. It's really interesting coming from a really hot, humid climate where you've grown up,
Mm,
and then moving to the UK, which is complete opposite of that, and how architecture changes and how like what your childhood influences what you're doing and where your career
yeah.
goes. And so I've sort of given it, we had a wee chat previously about how you got into this, and I think that a lot of my wanting to, I'm really a huge advocate for comfort of people and existing buildings and making people comfortable within their space,
Mm,
using as little resource as possible. And I think that stems from growing up in Queensland, where the traditional architecture of Queenslanders are really simple, huge overhangs and verandas and high ceilings that are orientated to catch the breeze to allow the
mm,
hot air to circulate through the property. And they're all based around creating comfortable spaces when it's ridiculously hot outside. And I think of growing up with that sort of influence how I look at buildings when when they're not working and you're having to pump loads of energy into them to cool them or heat them. It allows you to think back to, well, what was being done correctly a couple hundred years ago.
yeah, exactly. I was just thinking, is that where your interest in passive house comes from then? Because that's really, you know, as much as an energy standard, it's about comfort, isn't it? It's about kind of having a healthy indoor environment.
Yes, it would. I would. A passive house, I reckon, is probably 50-50 between an energy standard and creating a comfortable environment for
Yeah,
people to just
yeah,
to be in with by using as little energy as possible. And I think, yes, that's definitely where my roots come from, is and why
yeah.
passive house is so appealing to me. And also I find passive house really logical. It's an
Mm,
easy way to, it explains every element that you need to do in construction to make sure that a building is using as little energy as
yeah.
possible and creating the most comfortable space for the occupants, whether it's existing or new. So yeah.
And did you do your architecture training in Australia then, or did you do it over here?
Yes.
You did it in
Yes.
Australia.
Yeah. So I left Australia, and I'm not going to say the year, the day after graduation from a 6 year. So my university course was 6 years at uni, and you're working simultaneously,
Yep,
4 days a week as well, and going to uni at nights and for a
yep,
long day.
yep.
So when you came out of that, you had a lot of practical skills
Mm,
ahead of your contemporaries that were just at uni or so. Yeah, did that. And then I got qualified in Chester, just outside of Manchester,
okay.
um, in the early noughties. Let's just say that.
As specific as we need to be, we don't need to go into details.
Yeah, and then so yeah, spent quite a bit of time in Manchester, and then when the global financial crisis hit, I went back to Australia for a few
All right.
years, and then
Yep.
came back here in the early teens. So I've been
Hmm.
here for, yeah, all in all about 20 years over the
Yeah.
last.
And where did you start? When did you, or maybe it's been all the way through, I don't know, start this interest with existing buildings?
I'm not really sure. I can't really pinpoint it. I think
Mm,
spent a lot of my career in architecture, I mean, I didn't really have the courage to say, look, I'm going to just really pursue sustainable construction until the last 5 years. I think I've spent the last quite a while honing my skill as an architect, and that is about all types of construction. And I think I've just always kind of pushed towards refurbishing buildings and looking at buildings, but I've also done some fantastic new builds along the way.
Yeah.
And I have moved from a couple of firms. I've moved to go to certain projects. I couldn't really pinpoint it. I think it's
No, that's
just
fair enough.
being aware and very conscious that the buildings we've got here by 2050, 80% of them are already here, and we need to make do with what we've got and use less, basically.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say you use the word courage, really, because probably back in the whatever year it was, it was unusual, wasn't it? I moved into sustainability in 2005, and back then it wasn't really a thing. It wasn't like it is
No.
now. But now you absolutely have people coming into the construction industry, whatever element of it might be, set on working on sustainable buildings. That's it. That's their expectation almost. And in fact, I have seen people get a little bit sort of frustrated and disappointed that not every building is pushing as hard as it might, and that's a bit of a challenge for people to be able to manage, I suppose, manage the those new guys coming into the industry.
Yeah, I really think it is a challenge for them, and I think it's really exciting, and we need to have that excitement within the industry and those people coming in fresh to their careers who are focused purely on it, because we're
Mm,
still only we're just sort of starting to open the door into where we need to be. It's 2025, and
I know.
we've basically sat on our hands for the last 15 years as an industry, and we've only really in the UK, the construction industry's only really woken up since COP26,
Mm,
and so it's still new. Things take a long time to change. People take a long time to change. I think with anything, and particularly whether it's people or buildings, I always refer to an existing building is like a person. It's got to breathe. It's got to have airflow. It's got to have a certain amount of moisture to be comfortable, and
yeah.
but not too much. And you can't change it quickly. It's got to be incremental change. So when you're looking at a construction industry and you're looking at people, not everybody does well with change quickly. Incremental change is the way to go. But you need all these people who are really strong and understand it to
Yeah,
to
no, I
to pull
sorry.
it together.
Yeah, I agree. Do you know, I was thinking about this just recently, and I was thinking about how we gain experience in the construction industry, and it's different to some other industries. So I was thinking about doctors. I recently had to go into hospital unexpectedly, and the doctors that I saw there were all pretty young. I thought, I thought they were anyway. Not quite as young as the policemen, obviously, but they were young. So, uh,
Police and doctors. Maybe we should do another podcast, Kev.
right, maybe we
Come
should.
back to-
So, and I thought about how are these guys doing this work at this level at that age? And the thing I thought was, as a doctor, you probably see hundreds of patients in the space of a few months or whatever. In construction, you work on a handful of buildings in every 5 years or whatever. So actually, I think it takes quite a lot longer to build up a real wealth of experience in the construction industry just because of the length of the projects that we do versus other industries where there's a lot of turnover of cases or whatever it might be. I think that's a really interesting thing. And sometimes I also think that kind of, just to go back to that people thing again, is another frustration for younger people coming in. They've got to take the time, they've got to do the legwork to kind of get the experience to kind of progress and everything, and I think they find that frustrating sometimes. But anyway, there it is. So look, yeah, sorry, go on.
All right, I was just going to say, I think what's interesting is when I started out in the industry, and it was just a similar time to yourself, it wasn't really specialisms at this
Mm,
level. Like architecture, you had to be an all-rounder. You had to do everything. You had to know every different type of building typology and how it goes together. And architects, we have to know a little bit about a lot of different things. And now, to be able to come in as a sustainability specialist, you can say, well, I specialize in operational energy, or I specialize in embodied carbon, or I can
Yeah.
bring the two
Yeah, that's
together
right.
with relative to one particular element. But that didn't, in order to get to this point, I've had to go through all that process. Whereas now it's quite common to bring in specialists to do little bits and pieces throughout the thing, but only you've still generally got someone as an all-rounder in the background who's pulling it all together.
I agree, and I think that's absolutely true. And I've seen it in engineering. I mean, I started back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, in contracting, and then design work, and then sustainability. And you're right, the more we learn, the more we understand, the more complex things become, and the more you need specialists to help you think about those things in that level of detail. And it's just the way it is. And maybe we will get people who come along and they very specifically are experts in the repurposing of existing buildings of certain types in certain sectors. Who knows? And on that point, why should we worry about existing buildings? Why don't we just knock down those old and inefficient buildings and build some nice new efficient things in its place? What's
Can
the
I
argument?
throw it? Well, I'll throw it back at you. Why
Okay.
do we have unlimited resources and unlimited ability to create concrete and steel and stone and so why throw away something because it's a little bit dirty or a little bit misshapen when you could tweak it instead of getting something new? I mean, the bulk of the energy that goes into and carbon that goes into creating concrete and steel and mortar is in those initial processes of getting it out of the ground. And
Yeah.
so if we can reduce that and taking things from first principles by keeping the bones of what we've got and changing the dressing, or I don't know, I'm making up words now. Um, but like, why do that when you've already spent the carbon and on creating the existing building in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. That whole thing around resource efficiency is a massive thing, isn't it? And I think a lot of people, I think more and more people are getting switched on to that, I think. But for a client who's commissioning a building, that new building that is, in their mind at least, purpose built and will fulfill exactly their requirements rather than mostly fitting their requirements and there having to be some compromise. When they go into a project, that's probably, they think that's the better solution. But we all know that even in a new building, even in those new design schemes, there's always compromise. There's always something that kind of has to give. So it's rarely, well, I don't know if you agree with this, but it's rarely absolutely everything that we might wish it to be, just because there are always constraints of some description. If you agree
I,
with that or not.
I completely agree with you. I think as an industry and as we have a responsibility to our clients to help them understand what something could be. And if they've got a site and a particular building and they want to do certain things with it, and it's just completely nigh on impossible, they need to understand the way that the building functions and what can happen with that building. And if it's not, at the end of the day, if it's not going to work for them, there is an obvious solution, which is try a different building that could do it, or change your
Yep.
expectations. Or we need to start thinking a little bit differently about what we want and how. And the way to achieve that is down to the design teams to start thinking outside of the box about what is possible. An existing commercial building can be a perfect residential building. Some
Mm.
can be labs. Some existing labs can be commercial and residential. But it's about starting to think about what things could be rather than demand what you want and why you want that. And I think if at the end of the day, if you've done all the analysis and you've sat down with the experts and you've surrounded yourself with the best people, and they've advised that that building's not going to do what you need it to do, then you look at the other options, which are potentially start to knock it down or look at another
Mm.
site or
Mm.
whatever. But there's a lot of there's a lot of buildings that exist that are sitting there empty
Yeah.
that could do with some serious TLC, and we could save a lot of carbon by reusing what we've got,
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's that whole thing about you said there about changing your expectations. I think that's a really important thing, isn't it? And that whole initial conversation, and it's typically architects who often have those very first conversations with clients, aren't they? Perhaps even before some of the other design team are appointed or whatever. So, architects are in a key position to help manage the expectations of the client. But do you think that perhaps there are plenty of architects out there who are very enamored of the new shiny building with their name on it?
Oh, yeah.
Slightly leading question.
That is a very leading question. I mean, some lovely buildings that I quite happily go past and say, I worked on that. That was a new
Yeah,
build and things like that.
yeah.
I mean, that's what you're trained for, isn't it? At the end of the day, that's what you grew up with. That's often how you got into the industry, was about creating spaces. I got into architecture because I wanted to create spaces for people to be comfortable and well in. I've always had that at the back of
Mm,
my
mm,
mind, and that's driven the way that I've worked. And then obviously got to PassivHaus Designer. It's just like they go hand in hand. But yeah, other people get into the industry for a variety of reasons, and the
mm.
big shiny building is always
I
nice.
was looking at a report from CNN the other day. Somebody posted it on LinkedIn, and it had, I think, top 10 buildings from around the world that were due to finish this year, I think, or something like that. And one of them was the redevelopment of a railway station in, I think it might have been Boston in the US, and it had this amazing facade on it, they retained, and then behind it was like a 40-story, 100% glazed tower. And I thought, how
Wow.
how are we still building these, and why is CNN celebrating it as being a fantastic thing? It was crazy. Anyway, I guess some people still like those things and get their heads turned by those things, don't they? But I mean, let's not get into a whole debate of form and function. I mean, maybe that's a topic that's too big for right now. But the function thing is really important when it comes to existing buildings. And I do wonder in the back of my mind, when we think about keeping our existing buildings running for as long as possible, how able are they to meet the demands of a modern working environment? Do you think there are any limitations there, or do you think actually it's about just selecting the right building and managing your expectations?
That's a very big question. There is a there's so many different parameters,
Mm,
and each client has different requirements for different things. And I think what's really important is to, as a client, listen to your team and give your
mm,
team time. And I think time is worth more than anything else. Time spent at the beginning actually analyzing. If you've got an existing building, it's not going to be a walk in the park to refurbish a building, particularly if you're changing the use
mm,
type. And the best money you will spend on that building is, in my opinion, time at the beginning, at the feasibility stage, to really get into the bones of what can be done to that building realistically, not just from a space perspective, which is obviously important, but also from the, some buildings are not ever going to get to an NFIT passive house standard. That's
mm,
just not feasible for the type of building that it is. It might be that it's a category A listed building, or a 2-star listed building in England, and it's got beautiful cornicing and it's got beautiful architraves and skirtings and things like that, and there's beautiful finishes internally that are part of the listing. And it might be the stonework outside is gorgeous as well, and it's in a really good condition. So
yep.
what do you do to that? And there
Mm,
is things that you can do to it to make it more energy efficient, and but there's limitations on how far you can go before it will start to to be detrimental to the actual building itself, and the breathability and the livability and continuing the life of the building. So you have to take all that into account. And then you also have to take into account what you're wanting to do with the building and the internal spaces. And I think if you can give your team time to fully analyze and look at the different options up front, instead of rushing that process, when you do move forward, it will be a quicker, easier, smoother process.
yeah, I mean, time is. it's always such a challenge, isn't it, on construction projects? And it does make me wonder, who is it who is advising clients about the timescales of projects, and whoever they are, maybe you can say who you think it is. I mean, I presume it's probably project managers. I guess they're the guys who probably interact very early on with a client. They help them appoint the team and things. But whoever it is who's advising clients about the time taken for various parts of the process maybe needs to have a think about that and make sure. I mean, maybe if there was one here now, maybe they say they do think about it. But in my experience, it's often the case that timescale is a really significant constraint for the design team all the way through the project, to be honest, not just at the start.
I agree with you. I think the industry as a whole needs help and needs more education in how to move forward with refurbishing existing buildings, and it's not just the architects and engineers that need to do that. I think the entire team need to understand to a certain extent what the intricacies are about refurbishing existing buildings so that we can work better together as a team. And if you don't have that knowledge, I think there's something really strong about having the humility to ask the team members around you who do have that knowledge, and actually just like, none of us know everything there is to know about this. We're all learning. Every day's a school day. And so I think being able to be open and honest about that and sitting as a team and working through things, then we will get there. But we're not going to get there by ourselves, and we're certainly not going to get there if we've got one project manager going one direction, an architect in another, and a client and an engineer in opposite directions.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the best teams that I've worked on definitely are those where it's okay to say that. It's okay to say, well, I'm not sure, I don't know, we're gonna have to do the work to find out, or can you help me understand this or that or whatever it might be. For sure, definitely. I just want to come back. You mentioned listed buildings, and another thought struck me about, well, I mean, I don't want to get too involved in, the merits of listing buildings or not listing buildings, but are there eras of buildings I guess this is UK specific now, perhaps, that have less merit than others? So some eras of buildings where things were kind of thrown up maybe and they weren't done very well. Actually, they just don't lend themselves as easily to refurbishment because I don't know, the materials that used weren't such good quality, or I don't know, whatever other sort of practices were in place during that period. Or is that a complete red herring?
I think you could potentially say that, but I think that every building needs to be looked at individually, because you can't just like knock out an entire period of time of construction and say, well, that was crap, let's just knock them down. That was a very broad statement there, Kev. I think.
Well, I thought I'd throw it in,
Yeah.
just lobbing the odd hand grenade. I mean,
Yeah.
so I suppose it leads on to my next question, really, which is about sometimes some buildings aren't going to be right for
Yes.
refurbishment, as you say. Sometimes that's just going to be how it is. But even then, they're still made of stuff, and the stuff can still have a use, right? So how much have you seen not wholesale refurbishment even, or maybe just a kind of deconstruction of a building and the reuse of materials in whatever comes after it? Have you seen that, much of that? Is it expanding? Is there more of it?
It is expanding. I think it's a really growing industry. I think what I'm not aware of at the moment, but what would be brilliant, is a centralized place where you could advertise that you've got pieces of a certain size of this type of material that are in good quality, basically a vinted for construction parts.
Mm.
And then you could, I think what we are seeing is it's very difficult, and it takes a lot of time, and you have to really be committed to taking existing pieces from an existing building and reusing them. But we are seeing structural engineers, for example, specifying ranges of steel so that they can use steel that's been
Okay.
reclassified, that has come out of buildings, but it might have a few extra bolt holes in it. It might be a bit longer than what they need, and so that it has to be cut down. So it might be a bit stronger than what's needed for that particular aspect of the building, but it is there. But
Mm.
getting a central database would make life a heck of a lot easier. When you look at recycling of bricks and things like that, they have to be structurally sound still. They have to be kept in a good condition.
Mm.
For years, there's existing internal finishes that you can move and go to salvage yards and things like that. And
Yeah.
there
Oh
is
yeah, that's
salvage
true. Yeah.
yards for facade materials and things. You just We just have to a centralized database that would be able to look at and test the fire stability and the strength and then store something. It's so complicated at this day and
Yeah.
age with all of the issues around facades and the fire rating and
And the Building Safety
Grenfell
Act stuff
and
and all
Building
that. Yeah.
Safety Act.
Yeah.
And it's very complicated, but it is happening. It's just on a really small scale at the moment because of the complications and the amount of risk that's associated with it.
Mm. At the back of my mind, I've got a feeling that years ago I've seen something like that, and I don't know what and it probably wouldn't be fit for purpose now, perhaps. But as you say, with all those other extra things that we need to think about these days, but I feel like there's something out there. I might, if I manage to find something, I'll put it in the show notes. Anyway, so if I'm the owner of an existing building and I'm thinking to myself, God, crikey, this building really isn't doing what it needs to do in the modern, in the modern world, in the modern environment, whatever it is. What would you say to me in terms of making the decision about whether to refurbish it or to knock it down and build something else, or maybe just to sell it? I mean, is there, how do they make good decisions about those things?
Data collection. You need to understand what it is that's not working for you. So
Yeah,
is it the heating system and the electrics? Is that what's not working? Because that's a pretty easy,
yeah,
relatively easy fix. And that's the easiest way to save energy. The first place you go is making sure that the heating systems and the electrics are working. And then we need to really start to look at the fabric of the building and understand, is it structurally sound? Has it got water ingress? Has it got any rot anywhere? How is it functioning? Is it really leaky? Is it too leaky? How much
mm,
can we reduce the air that's infiltrating into the building? But also, when we look at that, we need to understand how far we can take the ventilation system to balance it out so that we're not going to be doing anything that's detrimental to the bones of the building, essentially.
yeah, yeah,
Why do you want to refurbish this building or knock it down? Has it got the right head height to allow for the ventilation system to work? If you're wanting to change a residential building into a lab building, that's a bit insane. Possibly it might not have the structural stability in the floor plates to do that. Do you need to put a lift in? Do you need to, it's it's basically a checklist you can write and go through every aspect of it and start to understand why things aren't working. If you've got a residential building and you say, look, I want to convert that to a lab building, I can pretty much say without looking at it that that's going to be a bit bonkers. Just because, especially if it's like a level 4 lab that needs
yeah.
vibration
You
control
might want to
and
think
all these
again.
things. Maybe try something new. But if you've got a commercial building and you want to convert it to residential flats, oof, that's when it starts to get exciting because they're generally got higher ceiling heights
Yeah.
and they're really got the structural stability and big spans and things like that that
Mm.
allow us to be really creative and start to use our design skills to make something interesting. But if you don't collect the data and do that initial analysis,
That's when it
you're
gets
not going to
tricky.
know. Yeah.
I also hear a lot about stranded assets, and maybe it's bigger investors who are finding this, but they've got a portfolio of buildings and they're looking at all of them and they're saying, well, actually, that building, and that building, in 5 years' time, nobody's going to want to lease that from us. So what do we need to do to do something with that? So it feels like there's more of an imperative now than there ever was before for the owners of those buildings to look at them and say, okay, what do we need to do? Let's do something in advance of finding ourselves with a stranded asset suddenly, and then we've got a major problem. So it feels like I don't know what you think. Do you kind of see the level of interest in refurbishing buildings, repurposing buildings, however deep that refurb might be, is really accelerating?
It definitely is. I think people are definitely seeing the benefits of it. I think what's interesting with some stranded assets, and you start to look at, and this is not my area of expertise, but I think people are starting to look at the wider estate and what is in that area and what could be in that area over the next 5, 10, 15, 30 years, and starting to understand and think about how we're going to work in that 10, 20, 30 years, and it's those forward thinking estate owners or that is starting to drive really good change and fix stranded assets like that.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned before about this idea of, the different things that you might do to a building to make it better, give it a longer life, I suppose. And you talk about fabric measures particularly. And I think over the years I've looked at fabric measures quite a few times, and very often if you've got a suite of measures that you might do to a building, and I'm coming particularly from a carbon reduction point of view here, I suppose, given my background, but you might do a load of stuff to the services, as you said, or you might replace all the windows. And when you look at the financial prospect of those two things, it's almost always the case that the fabric stuff just never really seems to stack up. So what's the argument for doing that? For doing that stuff, is it about kind of longevity? What's it about?
It's about comfort. It's about
Great, yeah,
changing and creating wellness for the people inside. So the bulk of the temperature that you feel in a space is not what the radiator's pushing out at you. It's the ambient temperature. Ambient's not the right word.
It's the radiant. It's the radiant effect, isn't it, from the windows and stuff.
From
Yeah,
the windows and those walls. So if you've got a single glazed window and it's 0 degrees outside, the surface temperature of that window is going to get to is about 5 degrees. And so you're going to feel the temperature difference between that window and the radiator, and that's your draft. A double glazed unit will get closer to 12, and a triple is going to get close to the surface temperature of about 17. So there's much less temperature differential between the surface temperature and that radiant heat that you're getting off that and what the radiator is pumping out. So less drafts. It's very, very rare that upgrading the fabric is going to stack up financially for a carbon per pound basis, but you need to look at your values and look at why you're doing it. And upgrading the fabric is about creating nice, comfortable, well spaces for people to be in. And now more than ever, we want to be in our homes and we want to be comfortable, and we don't want drafts, and we spend more time in our homes or even in our office space. You don't want to be having one person in one corner of the office sitting there with 3 jumpers and an electric radiator at their feet, and then someone on the other side is sitting there in a t-shirt sweating because it's just not balanced.
I think that comfort thing is so interesting because historically my view has been, I suppose, relatively narrow, because that's been my brief on a project. I've gone into an organization, looked at their building, said, okay, how can we reduce carbon in this building? And that's been the basis of the conversation. But actually, when you think about that more holistic view, and the reason I think the comfort thing is so interesting is that adds a lot of long-term value to the building, doesn't it? If it's a building that people want to be in, it's people the building want to lease or live in or whatever it might be. So that brings me back then to the thing you mentioned before about the whole team. We talked briefly about project managers, but another kind of role in this whole ecosystem are the agents. And I think it's really interesting, their role, and about how the value they place on buildings in the market and what they advise clients about. Well, if you do this, you can get that in terms of a rent or a yield or whatever it might be. And I do wonder if there's evidence that you know of that points to those buildings actually being a more attractive prospect for a client, i.e. they're going to get a higher yield for it.
I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that in the big cities. That's becoming really evident, and particularly in London, you're starting to see a lot more emphasis being put on the well standard, for example, which is purely about comfort. And off the back of COVID and trying to bring people back in the office, for example, the offices need to be a place where people want to come and want to be. And so there needs to be something that's enticing to get there. You don't want to go into an office where you're going to be sitting with either 3 jumpers or with a t-shirt because you're too hot. You want to be comfortable. That it needs to be a space where you can just go and work and be with people and want to be there. So the well standard, which is purely about creating comfortable environments that's well and low toxins and high oxygen and is really pushes that to the forefront. And we are seeing
Yeah.
agents seeing the value in that, and that those green buildings now and green marketing. And I think that's I think that's the way to go. And we are seeing a lot of those early adapters being the big corporates that when they're looking for new office space, that's what they want. And that will drive the industry and start to push through the industry and improve the spaces that we are creating. And we need that. We need those agents there at the table to be saying, well, no, they're not. You're going to end up, if you build that building like that, you're going to be pushing yourself out of the market because people, they're starting to ask for this, and this, and
Yeah. In the same way that there are still architects out there who like, big shiny new buildings, there are still project managers out there who don't give enough time, don't advise enough time for the design team, and there are still agents out there who kind of, are using those old school valuations perhaps, which don't take account of those things that we're seeing now. And there's so much in this, isn't there? The thing you said about big corporates wanting those amazing office spaces that people want to be in, and that's when I look at the people that I know that are new coming into the industry, they've got such expectations when they come in about what their workplace is going to be like. It's got to be good for recruitment and retention and having a happy, engaged workforce to go to a place that is, not only exciting, doing great work, but also really comfortable, enjoyable, and also that they know kind of aligns with more and more people's values around this whole issue of sustainability and working for a company that aligns with their values.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think for us as sort of old timers in the industry now, we need to remember that people are like buildings, and incremental change is the way that we're going to move this forward. It's not going to happen. We're not going to have overnight every type of lease being updated to allow for well comfortable spaces. It's going to be a slower process than what we like. But having young people coming out of university who want to work and drive this industry and being comfortable spaces is exactly what we need to start to push that wave through the industry. I think we're in a really exciting time. I think with really big shifts coming, but I think it needs to be done incrementally because you need to bring people along with you. You can't necessarily force everybody into the boat all at once.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? Yeah, I think you're right. I think though the pace of change is accelerating, isn't it? Which is encouraging.
Yes.
I mean, maybe for those of us who's kind of been involved in this for a long time, it's still not quick enough, but nonetheless, it's accelerating, which is good and really positive. Well, look, Sam, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat about that. I know we can't talk about it right now, but you're about to start a new and exciting phase in your career, which is great, and I look forward to hearing more about that when that happens. It's been great talking. Let's talk again at some point.
Thanks, Kev. I've really enjoyed myself. Yeah, I would love to come back sometime once I'm in the new role and I can talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Sam.